So most of us are familiar with the Meshify C from Fractal Design at this point. Last year it was one of the most popular mid-tower cases available due to its relatively compact design, high airflow, and reasonable price point. Today we're checking out the new Meshify S2, which is a much larger option for the high airflow Meshify series, to see how it compares in terms of hardware compatibility and thermals. So of course, the iconic feature of the Meshify series is that angular mesh front panel that catches the light in an oddly satisfying way and allows for a ton of ventilation for those front intake fans. Now, the Meshify S2 may look familiar, and that's because it's actually built off of the Define S2, which released a few months ago and we actually reviewed and did a build on. And comparing the Meshify S2 with the Define S2 would honestly be about a 20 to 30 second video, if that, because all they've really changed is the front panel and the top panel, which are now mesh, with the front panel now having that iconic angular mesh as we looked at before. And so instead we're going to be comparing it with the Meshify C, which most of you are familiar with. And so if you do want a high airflow Meshify case from Fractal Design, which one is the best one for you? Firstly, you will pay a $60 premium for the Meshify S2 over the Meshify C, at least at the time of filming. The Meshify C has been out for quite a while at this point, so you can usually find one on sale. Height and width are very similar. The big difference though in terms of size is the added length of the S2, allowing a much more roomier interior compartment, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Both cases have a tempered glass side panel, which is a given at this point. The Meshify C has your standard side thumb screw mounting, whereas the S2 has a floorless surface with mounting via push pins and rear thumb screws. Drive compatibility is also slightly different for the two. Upgrading to the Meshify S2, you will lose a single 2.5 inch drive compared to the Meshify C, but you will gain an additional slot for a 3.5 inch drive. Now, just a bit of a refresh for those who missed the Define S2 review. The bottom section directly in front of the power supply can accommodate up to a 240 or 280mm radiator, which is quite incredible. And this leads us into our next point of discussion, which is support for water cooling, which is much stronger for the S2 since it is built off the larger Define series frame. I actually did a full custom loop in the Define S2 using the Threadripper 2950X and the GTX 1080 Ti, and I can confirm that there is plenty of room for a full open loop and tons of radiator clearance. Pumps and reservoirs can easily be mounted towards the front of the case on the rails, and there's also 2 vertical expansion slots for vertical GPU mounting. Now, I'm not going to act like building a custom loop in the Meshify C is impossible. Sure, it is more compact, but it definitely can be done with even a dual radiator configuration, but clearances and mounting just need to be a bit more creative. On the note of radiator support, it's identical for the front mounted position for both cases, allowing up to a 280 or 360mm rad, but in the top mounted position, the S2 takes the 240 support from the Meshify C and stretches that to support 360 and 420mm radiators. For regular builds that might just be using a front mounted AIO, you will need to consider how long your graphics card is if you are going with the Meshify C. In total, you've got 340mm of length to play with for your graphics card, but adding in a common AIO will bring that down to just 285mm. Long cards like the Asus Strix won't be compatible here, in addition to a front mounted radiator and fans, so you'll need to stick to more conservative length aftermarket cards or reference cards if that's your planned setup. Ultimately, this is fine and not really a drawback in my opinion. It's just an extra consideration when planning out your build. For air cooling though, the Meshify C is perfectly adequate, seeing as it is wide enough to accommodate even the very largest of air coolers out there with height clearance of up to 172mm. I might as well introduce the test system here at this point as well, as we have made some changes moving into 2019. So here we've got the Ryzen 7 1700 underneath the Dark Rock 4 from Be Quiet, and the GPU that we're using is the GTX 1080 Strix from Asus. This system is a great fit for the Meshify C, relatively speaking, but in the Meshify S2, the system does look a bit lost. There's so much unused space for a standard system like this towards the front of the case that if you are buying the Meshify S2, you'd better hope you're making use of all of that clearance. Okay, now let's talk about airflow and thermal performance between these two cases, as that is the feature and selling point of the Meshify series. So out of the box, the Meshify C comes with 2 120mm fans, one configured as exhaust and one as intake, and the Meshify S2 comes with 3 140mm fans, 2 intake and 1 exhaust. CPU thermals are pretty close between the two, and again this is with a slight overclock on the Ryzen 7 1700 with the the Dark Rock 4 cooler. And with the Meshify C running 2 intake and 2 exhaust fans, that does beat the S2 by a single degree, but nothing really significant. For GPU thermals, both cases were identical out of the box, with the GTX 1080 Strix sitting at 61 degrees C, the same as the NZXT H500, which we'll discuss a little later. Since the front intake fans on the Meshify C are closer to the graphics card than the S2, we can achieve a cooler result on the GPU when adding in a 120mm fan. So system thermals are pretty close, they're virtually identical, and there's nothing really worth worrying over between the two. The big decider between the Meshify C and the Meshify S2 is whether you're building a standard ATX system or you're going for a big custom loop. Now that might seem quite self-explanatory from the beginning, but you'd be very surprised how many people buy big cases like the Meshify S2, the Define R6, and even the NZXT H700, and they populate a system like this with maybe one radiator and that's it, and basically all of that extra space does go to waste. More often than not, relatively compact mainstream cases like the Meshify C and the NZXT H500 are the way to go for most systems. There's less air to move throughout the case, so they require less fans in comparison to larger cases, and they'll free up more space on or underneath your desk. You might even want to consider going ITX if you don't need a ton of radiator space. A 240mm AIO, for example, is plenty for most systems these days anyway. The H500 from NZXT still gets an honorable mention even a few months after launch. Aside from the Meshify C, this is what I'd ultimately recommend for most users. For the power users out there that need a multi-GPU setup in a custom loop with plenty of airflow, the Meshify S2 certainly makes that possible, but then again so did the Define S2, and thermals there were certainly adequate and on point with the Meshify C as well. So I'm not going to pretend that the Meshify S2 is revolutionary or the next best case. It is after all the Define S2 swapped with those angular mesh panels. That's of course okay because people do like options. I will have a few of these cases linked in the description down below so you guys can check out pricing and make your own mind up, and I'd love to hear your thoughts down below on the Meshify S2. In closing, the original Meshify I feel is the better fit for the majority of users out there, unless you're building a massive custom loop. As always guys, a huge thanks for watching, consider subscribing down below if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one.